Great. Well, then I'm going to do that. Do you want to read it all?
I do.
Okay. Do you want to go first or second?
Okay, I'm ready.
Oh, can you hear me? Sorry. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Um,
Did you hear me say, did you want to go first or second?
yeah, I can go first.
You want to go first? Okay.
Sure.
And then just read till you want to stop. And then whenever you stop, I'll
Okay.
back up.
Okay, sounds good.
Feel free to pause and ask questions, or like we can just let it be flowy and organic. And then whatever we get through, we get through it.
Okay, that sounds wonderful.
Fantastic.
From the anti-barbarians. The pagans perfected systems of knowledge according to the divine plan, not for us to scorn them, but for our use. When I look a little more closely at the wonderful arrangement, the harmony, as they call it, of things, it always seems to me, and not to me only, many of the weightiest authors have thought the same, that it was not without divine guidance that the business of discovering systems of knowledge was given to the pagans. For the great and eternal disposer, who is wisdom itself, establishes all things with consummate skill, differentiates them with beautiful play of interchange, and orders them with perfect rightness, so that each balances another in a marvelous way. Nor does he allow anything to move at random in all the immense variety of the world. It was he who willed that golden age in which he had chosen to be born, was to be sovereign over all epochs which came before or followed after. It pleased him that whatever existed in nature should be put to use for increasing the happiness and glory of that time. He himself promised that this should be done. If I be lifted up from the earth, he says, will draw all unto me. Here it seems to me that he most aptly uses the word traho, I draw, so that one may understand that all things, whether hostile or heathen, or in any other way far removed from him, must be drawn, even if they do not follow, even against their will, to the service of Christ. What of that great universal harmony, which in the eyes of St. Augustine meant that not even bad things were created without intention? All those allegories, signs, and mysteries existing from the beginning of the world, in which direction did they point? Why, to the century of Christ. What about the whole Mosaic law, all those rites and ceremonies, those forms of worship, those promises and prophecies? Is not Paul the witness that all these things happened to them for examples? Not to speak of the transfer of empires. What was the purpose of founding the Roman nation with such vast effort and through such great disasters and blood-stained victories, subjugating the entire world to the city which held sway? Was it not according to the divine plan, so that when the Christian religion was born, it might be spread abroad more easily into different parts of the world, diffused, as it were, from one head into the separate members? And again, what was his intention in allowing almost the whole earth to be entangled with such lunatic, scandalous religions? Why? So that when the one arose, it would overturn all the others with the utmost glory. Nothing fine is ever done without struggle. It thrills me.
It thrills you. Tell me all the things.
Well, I think one of my most favorite things about this class and everything that I read, and even the content with which that we're learning and that we're reading, it is the relations and the connections. And so I see that in the first section, for the great and eternal disposer, who is wisdom itself, establishes all things with consummate skill, differentiates them with beautiful play of interchange, and orders them with perfect rightness, so that each balances another in a marvelous way. nothing moves at random. And I see that those connections and those relationships and what we read and the different things. And I see it in here. And it makes me happy. That just the connections, the interweaving.
Yeah, I really love that. I mean, what stood out to me and today, it's just been like a super emotional day for me. It was the last day of classes, and my students did all their recitations today, and literally every single one of them just was sobbing the entire time. They were so beautiful, and it just feels like a day of endings. But then it's also made me think about my kids and reflect on the things I didn't do that I wanted to do, or the things as moms that we think about, or that we're like, I wish I had done that, or I'm sad I didn't do that, or I hope that decision didn't mess them up too bad. So it's been like that kind of day of reflecting all that. And so because that's on my mind, what was emerging for me was nothing was at random, but seeing it, like, I know he was talking about it in a cosmic sense, but I saw it in a very like personal sense, like just in that macrocosm. There's always these microcosms of our own lives, and I'm that that I totally screwed up everything with the mistakes I've made. Like everything works together for the good of those. Yeah, and so yes to what you're saying, and also like I was thinking about that.
I love it. I also am reminded, I've been listening to a lot of Angelina and Stanford, and all of her, the part where it talks about all of those allegories, signs, and mysteries, and everything pointing to Christ. And then also just the intention with which we can see Christ deciding to come, and the importance of that in order for, it was just the people and the land were prepared for his arrival and for his truth and his light to be made known throughout all. And I love that.
Yeah, it really
Anyway.
is amazing. Have y'all gotten to the point in your studies where you've studied Greek history like right before Christ came?
Not yet, no.
It's so amazing. Like especially when you start to study Plato and Greek philosophy, like when you get to that point, it's we'll do some of it in the fellowship too, when we do philosophy, but the very philosophical frameworks and ways of being and ideas that were like held there suspended for them to wrestle with were the very ones that were answered in Christ, which was why so many Greeks converted to Christianity. It was just like, oh, and we create all this confusion, and now
I love that. It's like it was they were asking just the right questions.
right. Which what a cool thought too. Like the chaos that I create in my own exploring and trying to figure things out is the perfect chaos for Christ to sweep in and then be like, "You're smarter." And you have all the right ingredients that were chaos to you, but now let the logos touch it, and it's like that's what I'm imagining.
Yes, the order. That's so good.
Maybe that's what apprehension is. That's what apprehension is. Oh, that's what apprehension is. Yeah,
Write it down.
Yeah, because have we talked about apprehension in the fellowship?
No.
Okay, so apprehension is this thing that the mind does where it's the light bulb moment. It's like, oh, I get it. Like it's where everything comes together and you're like, oh, I get it. So like, but to get there, you spread the feast, right? Like all these things that you're just feeding a person, and maybe it's questions, ideas, examples, whatever it is, the thing that you're studying, and then all of a sudden, with all this chaos of things you're comparing and presenting, all of a sudden it's like, oh, the light bulb goes off. And Dorothy Sayers in her essay, it's a book, The Mind of the Maker, she has this one section about comparing education to Pentecost, and she says it's the job of the educator to, or it's the job of education to wait upon Pentecost. And so she compares the idea of apprehension to Pentecost. So it like there's like all these levels where this dynamic is true, this cosmic level that you're speaking to, this personal level, but then also this like momentary level in the classroom where it's like, oh, apprehension, it's chaos and then order. And so if we're going to follow this pattern, which is exactly what he is talking about, whatever existed in nature should be put to use. The universal harmony, which is the idea of the logos. I mean, that's the philosophical understanding of the logos, like truth, goodness, and beauty. Truth, the logos, is the harmonizing principle. Is the harmonizing principle. I mean, I guess somewhere I knew that, but like I'm hearing it so differently today, right now, in this moment, that the logos really is the harmonizing principle. It's the thing that makes order out of chaos, but not just arbitrarily, like, I'm going to get this ship in order and then we're going to get this thing cleaned up. Like, not like that, but like genuine harmony, like order, like harmony, not order like everyone's in shape and we're doing the right thing, you know, like drill sergeant kind of order, like harmony order.
Order and almost like peace and shalom, like the way things are meant to be in relation to one another.
Yes, yes, yes. Mm-hmm. I like thinking about those two different kinds of order. It makes me rethink like the kind of order I've tried to keep in my home in the past. Like, I don't know, to this whole like distinction between drill sergeant order and harmony order. Or even in the classroom, like think of the implications for that for you know, in our homes, in the classroom, in any environment. Because like a garden that naturally comes up, there's harmony in it, but it's not a field. Like that's a different kind of order.
It also brings flitters of ideas in relation to the utilitarian versus what we truly desire, which is that seeking of the truth and the goodness and beauty again. And how, as much as we may say we want that peace and harmony or the truth, goodness, beauty, we can still fall into that drill sergeant utilitarian, make things happen mindset and activity within our lives and within our schools.
Yeah, and I think about when are the times I do that. The times I do that the most are the times that I feel the most disordered inside myself. And so I'll like clean my house or rearrange things or do something to make me feel better. But there's a different, I've been playing with like, yeah, I've been playing with an internal practice recently that when I feel impulse to go clean something, because I'm like, instead of doing that, I've been trying to like pause for a second and ask myself, what can I do inside that will cause ease within me, regardless of whether the kitchen is clean right now or not. And so I've been like playing with other ways of creating. I hadn't named it like that, but now that we're talking about this, oh, that's the geographical cure versus the actually truth and beauty coming in and affecting.
Just so you know, it does still sound like thunderstorms, but it's only when you move your hands. I think you're just hitting your thing.
How is that?
It's
okay?
better. It's okay. I want you to feel enthusiastic.
No, I want to know because people will find that entirely annoying if they have to listen to it, and nobody wants that insufferable experience. There's only so much chaos we can all endure. I mean, really. Oh, okay. So what you can do if you'll just like give me a thumbs down if I'm sounding wacky, then I'll. But if I take my headphones out, then everyone will hear me, and
And me, and they don't need to hear me.
they don't need to hear us. They didn't come for us.
They should stay home.
That part.
Are you sure you're going to record this and share it with your followers?
I mean, just decided a while ago I was going to be honest about my craziness. People can either hang with
Or hang up.
that part. Jody,
Okay.
there's a little too much chaos in my home right now. No worries. Oh, I'm so glad. We're here for the chaos, obviously. So you're right at home, Jody.
I love this. This is how you know we've progressed.
This is fantastic.
Okay, your turn.
Okay.
Your turn to read.
And you stopped at nothing fine is ever done without struggle.
Oh, yes.
One of the things.
This is exactly what you were saying about looking at how you raised your kids or what you would have wish you would have done differently. And I saw that picture of your son. Nothing fine is done without struggle.
Yeah. It's a I just got off the phone with him before we came on here, and he was in one of the he needed to express things that were not easy for me to hear. And so from there, yeah. So that's all I'm gonna say.
To be continued. I mean, for later. Okay.
Okay. So nothing fine is ever done without a struggle. Okay. It's landing. It's landing.
Mhm.
It was Greece. Is my voice okay?
It sounds. Oh,
Yeah. Okay. It was Greece, devoted to study, which discovered the arts. Then Latium entered into rivalry with her. It was the victor as far as concerns war, but barely equaled her achievements in literature and oratory. Some concerned themselves with searching out the hidden causes of things. Others, bound by the fetters of Prometheus, observed the regular revolutions of the heavenly lights. There were those who tried to explore divine mysteries. One discovered methods of arguments and another laws of oratory. Some portrayed the customs of men with great I know that's not it. I want to say sagacity, but I know it's pronounced a different way, but I honestly don't know how it's pronounced. And for some of their great concern was to hand on to posterity the memory of past deeds. In law, in philosophy, how the ancients labored. Why did all this happen? So that we, on our arrival, could hold them in contempt? Was it not rather that the best religion should be adorned and supported by the finest studies? Everything in the pagan world that was valiantly done, brilliantly said, ingeniously thought, diligently transmitted, had been prepared by Christ for his society. He it was who supplied the intellect, who added the zest for inquiry, and it was through him alone that they found what they sought. Their age produced this harvest of creative work, not so much for them as for us, just as every region cannot supply every commodity, nor, as Virgil says, does every land grow everything. So it seems to me that every century is allotted its own gifts. Many of the philosophers wore out their lives and their brains in seeking the highest good. But the real. Oh, I just got that. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that is funny. Many of the philosophers wore out their lives and their brains in seeking the highest good. That's like every homeschool mom. is what we do. Every classical teacher on the face of the planet. But the real highest good, okay, listen up, folks. Here's our answer. Here's our answer for rest. The perfect gift was reserved by Christ for his own time. However, he did not intend all the rest to be useless and done to no purpose. We see with our own eyes how in material things nature takes care that no portion of time shall slip away uselessly. Look at the trees. The sight of them suggests this example to me. In early spring, they supply sap to nourish the leaves. And now you see the leaves are joined by flowers, and how much pleasure it gives us to look at them. As summer comes, these little flowers swell out gradually into the pulp of the fruit in autumn. The trees will stand weighed down with ripe apples, and as soon as they let them fall once again, that season which passes from autumn into winter is spent in making new shoots for the coming summer. Even winter itself is not idle, but reestablishes things in an interval of quiet. The same effect is produced by the revolving of the heavenly bodies, disposed in such varying ways. There is a great discord in nature, which is the completest concord. All things, both particular and universal, are carried in the same direction. They all face the same way, tend toward one thing. Okay, this, I feel like this is why we are so exhausted. Because notice what he's saying here. He says, all things, both particular and universal, are carried in the same direction. We all face the same way, tend toward one thing. But what is unique about humans? We have free will, so we can choose to act outside of accordance with nature. And when we do, we miss out on that seasonal pattern that nourishes, gives us rest, produces fruit, produces a harvest. Like, what would happen if we gave ourselves permission to act in accordance with nature, to act in accordance with the seasons, to act in accordance with our daily bread and the hours of the day, the seasons of 24 hours. I mean, in a way, you can almost, one time my friend Renee and I, we were playing with comparing the 4 seasons in a year to 24 hours and how each section of the day kind of imitates the vibe of the 4 seasons, like nighttime being winter, the evening being fall, as your work is done, you have the harvest, and now you get to celebrate. In the morning is spring, you're planting your seeds, and then the midday is summer, where that's when the roots grow the deepest. You're like digging in, and we're like, what would happen if we just gave ourselves permission to do that? Like, what would that be like? Okay. So while Christ, the greatest and best of disposers, allocated to his own century in a special way the recognition of the highest good, he gave the centuries immediately preceding a privilege of their own. They were to reach the thing nearest to the highest good, that is, the summit of learning. What could man acquire by virtuous striving that is more valuable than knowledge? Indeed, on this point, God was willing to consult the laziness or the leisure of the Christians by taking away a great deal of the hard work from us, who were likely to have much to do elsewhere. It was much easier to master a thing which is already worked out to the last detail than to invent it. If they had not sown the seed of letters, perhaps we should have nothing to reap. What should we have discovered by ourselves? We who have never added anything to their inventions, but have damaged many of them and thrown them all into confusion. This makes it all the more ungracious, in fact, spiteful, that we should not be willing to accept things freely offered, which were to be of so much use to us, and which cost them so dearly. And we not only refuse a splendid gift, but treat the giver of the gift with contempt instead of the gratitude we owe them. Oh, that hits. I wonder if that Well, first, what do you hear?
So, a couple of things. One is a question. He uses the phrase letters, good letters, seed of letters, that it sounds like he's referring to work that was done prior to Christ and prior to the Christians. And are those letters referring to that which he was speaking of before, into what the Greeks discovered, the literature, the oratory, philosophy, law, how the ancients labored? Question mark.
Letters is like another name for humanities in a lot of ways. It just means the written stuff. So philosophy, history, literature, like all of that. Yeah. So when they say letters, they just mean like the things you read when you're doing grammar.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. So that was my one question, or I probably have more, but I think that it also hits back to what we talked about before, about how close that the ancients were, and in their searchings, in their longings, in their seeking.
They were talking about the logos. They were the Greeks are the ones who named truth, goodness, and beauty. They just didn't know. So that's why John 1 is so powerful. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. So what he was saying was, hey, that transcendent harmonizing principle for all of reality that you've been studying, that you figured out is this transcendent, thing that harmonizes all things. Oh, by the way, that's a person. That's Jesus. The logos came and became incarnate so that you could study him, so you could see him, so you could behold him, so you could participate in his life, and in participating in his life, become harmonized yourself. That thing that you couldn't figure out about how to overcome, the self-sabotaging, self-centered ways of being. Yeah, we have a solution for that too, and it's participating with the logos. And it was like that missing piece. And they had discovered all that. And then one step.
And then I love the part about, indeed, on this point, God was willing to consult the laziness or the leisure of the Christians by taking away a great deal of the hard work from us, who are likely to have much to do elsewhere. And just thinking about how do we needed to be in that spot of still wrestling with the philosophical questions. Not that it would have prevented, but they were truly focused on that great commission of taking Christ to all the lands. And that was what they were told to do. And God is just so kind and preparing for us. Also, sorry, I love the parts about the nature that you were talking about. And it reminds me of the importance of nature study, because it is just so easy to skip over it and forget that that truly is where one of the places where God says that he reveals himself is through creation. And that you don't really know, you don't really find yourself at home in the seasons unless you take the time to truly notice and to live and to do your journaling, or do your drawings, or to ponder, or to really observe, to really slow down in that.
Yeah, I'm just excited about what we're doing. And like, to your point, what you're saying, we decided to change up philosophy class for the high school class a little bit next year, and of course, we're still gonna read stuff and practice the philosophical mode of inquiry, but we're doing revolution next year, and so we're gonna study theory of change. And so instead of only just reading about it, we're actually gonna do studies in the butterfly and flowers, and I'm gonna have them study the life cycle of these things and draw pictures and make like nature observations, because one of the things I think is missing from philosophy class, at least in the one I've been teaching and the ones I've seen, is the philosophical mode of inquiry is supposed to be wide reaching, like asking all the questions, seeing from everything around you, and allowing that inspiration to come from any subject matter. And so shouldn't philosophy class model that then somehow? And it just, when I was like wrestling, I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna bring nature study into philosophy class this year. So I don't know how it's gonna go. I'm pretty excited about it though, but it's basically exactly what you were saying.
I don't think it can go wrong.
I know, right?
I mean, if we truly believe that God says that logos is within all, and we have the scripture and we have nature, and that is his gift to all of us, all of humanity. I just don't think it can go wrong. It'll be great.
Exactly. Okay. Shall we continue? I keep reading, or do you want to read again?
It is ignorance rather than erudition which makes men insolent. Now let us imagine two other people, both worthy men, one uncouth, the other educated. Which is to be preferred to the other? They shuffle and stammer. Just find a man, they say, who has both worth and learning. I admit that there is a great scarcity of this kind of person, for there are plenty of unlearned and unworthy people everywhere. But why should they stammer when Jerome never did? He freely and at the top of his voice, as they say, put saintly learning above saintly simplicity. Daniel, he says, at the end of his most holy vision, says that the righteous shall shine like stars, and the wise, that is the learned, like a firmament. Do you see what difference there is between righteous simplicity and learned righteousness? The first is compared to stars, the last to heaven. A little before this, he says, holy simplicity is profitable only to itself. And however much it builds up the church by the merit of the life lived, it does an equal amount of harm if it does not resist the destroyers. Jerome is right here, as in everything, for the more widely a good thing is known, the more influential for good it must be. The man who lives an upright life is indeed doing a great thing, but it is useful only to himself, or at most to the few with whom he passes his days. If learning is added to his upright life, how much the power of his virtue will be increased more brilliantly and more widely known, as if a torch had been set before it. And if he is one of those who can put down in writing the most beautiful meditations of his heart, that is, if he is eloquent as well as learned, the usefulness of this man must necessarily be widespread and pervasive, not only among his friends, his equals, his neighbors, but for strangers, for posterity, for the people at the uttermost ends of the earth. Worth without learning will die with its possessor, unless it be commended to posterity in written works. But where there is learned scholarship, nothing stops it from spreading out to all humanity, neither land nor sea, nor the long succession of the centuries. I would not like here to bring up an invidious comparison as to which has been of most value to our religion, the blood of the martyrs, or the pens of the learned writers. I'm not disparaging the glory of the martyrs, which a man could not attain to even by unlimited eloquence, but to speak simply of usefulness to us. We owe more to some heretics than to some martyrs. There was indeed a plentiful supply of martyrs, but very few doctors. The martyrs died, and so diminished the number of Christians. The scholars persuaded others, and so increased it. In short, the martyrs would have shed their blood in vain for the teaching of Christ, unless the others had defended it against the heretics by their writings. The Christian religion found good letters is a valuable safeguard in times of stress, and it will not be ungrateful now. It will not be so ungrateful now when it has peace and prosperity as to thrust them into exile, for it was through them that it attained peace and happiness. Do you want me to keep going?
You can, or I can pick up. Or Jody, do you want to participate in reading? Or do you want to just keep listening?
I'm just going to keep listening just because I might have to be in and out.
That's okay. I can finish this page and then we can go on.
Okay.
I cannot help being amazed at some people who quite deliberately admit that they shun literature. We have already shown how idiotic it is to say they are abstaining from the inventions of the heathen. Is there anything in what they say about wishing to avoid pride? Surely it is not so much because their weak minds tremble as because they want a cover for their indolence that they invent a sin where no sin is. I could believe these people were simply mistaken if they altered their ways when admonished and rebuked. But what kind of religion will that be for fear of some trifling trouble falls into utter ruin? So while these silly fools, trembling like women, do their stupid best to flee from naughty curiosity, they fall into a different but much dangerous vice. It is in vain that it is in vain that you have avoided one vice if you have turned to wrong ways by another, says Horace. You have escaped from Scylla to no purpose if you fall into Charybdis?
Yeah. Do you know what that's referring to?
No, I was going to ask you, who's Horace?
So Scylla and Charybdis is how I pronounce it. That could be wrong, but there are two monsters in the Odyssey. So when Odysseus is wandering home, he gets to this one impasse where it's a very narrow strait, and on one side is Scylus and the other side is Scylla and the other is Charybdis. They're both monsters, and no matter what side he goes on, his men are going to be killed from his boat by one of the monster or the other. And so there is no choice but to endure the suffering of one of the monsters. He can't entirely escape both. And so that's what that is a reference to.
Oh, God, I'm so glad I have your experience with me as I read. Can you just be in my head while I'm reading? Okay, here we go. It is no good avoiding the storm only to break up your ship on the rocks. The childish, not to say perverse, timorousness of these people is what David was talking about.
For a second, where it says it's there's no good avoiding the storm only to break up your ships on the rocks. So one of them would have caused all of the people to die. The whole ship would have just been done. Where the other one had like all these heads and would just reach out and eat some of the sailors. So while that was also a tragedy, it was a choice between trying to avoid this monster where it's going to eat your men, but then your whole ship is just going to drown. So yeah, that was the.
Well, that would be a really difficult choice to make. Okay. The childish, not to say perverse, timorousness of these people is what David was talking about, that holiest of kings and prophets. They were afraid where no fear was. I love that line. For the man who superstitiously observes the wind will never trust himself to the sea, and the one who anxiously watches the clouds will never reap. What could be more disastrous than to raise up imaginary fears where the most distinguished work is to be done, and snore idly away where there is acute and certain danger? With their idiotic solicitude, they want to remove the mote of curiosity from our eyes, and do not feel the beam of laziness in theirs. They reproach us with always wanting to learn more when we know more than enough already, but they take no interest in learning the things without which we are not human or even alive.
What do you think of that? I'm amazed by this section. I'm just in love with this section. This is so much of what I feel like I've encountered in my journey of classical education, especially like in very conservative situations. Like, I mean, there's been times where I remember we went to this one church for a while and somebody was scolding my child. But that's a different conversation. But for reading the Chronicles of Narnia, they're like, there's witches in there, and I mean, it was a big deal. Like they were angry, and they were like accusing, basically my daughter of introducing witchcraft to their child. Like it was insane, and like as you were reading, I'm like, this is what was happening. Like this is exactly what was happening, and even like what's crazy is, I mean, times in my life where I've been led by fear, not in that particular situation, but other ones where I've become one of the other images that comes to my mind about this is the part in the Aeneid where, are you familiar with the story at all? Okay, so this is when like the end of the Trojan War and Aeneas is like, gets kicked out, be like, hey, go find Rome. So he's like the founder of Rome. So they make him, his ancestors and the gods make him leave so that he can go be the founder of Rome. Bless you. Anyway, there's this point on the journey where a bunch of the women that are traveling with them from Troy to their promised land, their Zion, and they burn the ships because they're so tired of traveling. And they're content to settle in this place that is not their Zion. It's not their promised land, but they're so frustrated, so tired, so fearful that they are unwilling to endure on for Zion. And I feel like I experienced both of those. Like, so the laziness, I feel like that, and then, but also the fear. And yeah, it just names so many experiences I've had with other people, also with myself. And so then what's the journey been then? This is why in the fellowship we talk so much about personal development and noticing what's going on in our own being. Because if I'm afraid, guess what I'm doing? This right here. Yeah, so I get to confront myself and notice without judgment, like, hey, I'm reacting out of fear. I'm not going to create anything good when I'm allowing fear to animate and be the animating energy behind what I do.
Did you have anything to say, Jody?
Yeah, I mean, that's really good. I can definitely relate to being in churches, and I think that kind of goes back with your like point earlier about being in ship shape, kind of authoritarian style order. And as humans, we want to know the right thing, and we want to create rules and steps to get there, and we want it to look really harsh and structured. And I really liked this reading because it really opens that up and shows that that's not exactly how God works. It's not pretty and perfect in a time. I mean, it is perfect, but it's not the way we think perfect should be. Yeah. So just changing that mindset of, oh yeah, okay, I'm getting into my like works related order and not Jesus order.
Found out Barnes and Noble closes in 10 minutes. I thought they were open until 10.
So now you get to talk to us in your car.
Something like that. Go sit out on the bench. Duly noted.
Al fresco. Paideia Fellowship, al fresco.
That's what we do. I'm just gonna roll with it. Thank you for sharing, Jody. Sorry I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I think that this part really resonated to me too, because as much as I can say, oh, I love that phrase, they were afraid where no fear was. I am so convicted and so aware. Like I almost cried just now when I'm reading those lines about the imaginary fears. I struggle with that. Because most of them usually never come true. But why do I? God help us.
Well, I think that's so brave to notice that. How do we distinguish between fear and wisdom? And like when we're feeling afraid, what exactly are we in battle with? Like, what are we in resistance with? It reminds me of like what you were sharing about your fear about narration. And then like this is like a perfect example of what you were talking about with that. And then when you saw it come to pass, you're like, yeah. Okay. What line are we at?
You should read that line again about they reproach us, because that line is really good and could be worth reading again out loud.
They reproach us with always wanting to learn more when we know more than enough already, but they take no interest in learning the things without which we are not human or even alive. Supposing we have overstepped the limits, which is the way of honor, where honorable things are concerned, to go too far or not far enough, it is better to exceed or fall short. They are afraid that somewhere in the pagan books they might find something that sounded not quite strict enough to crabbed ears. But they are not afraid of that terrifying word of the Lord, thou wicked servant, wherefore grievest thou not my money into the bank that at my coming I might have required mine own with usury? So true it is that there is nothing so unpleasing to God as sloth. The prodigal son who had spent all his substance on harlots, pimps, and cook shops, he joyfully welcomed back. But the servant who returned, to him even an undiminished talent was bitterly reproached. God, our parent, imparted to us as seeds of fine skills, intellect, understanding, memory, and other gifts of the mind, which are talents put out to usury. And if we double them by practice and study, our Lord on his return will praise us as industrious servants and give them to us for our inheritance. But if we bury the talent we have received in the ground, how shall we bear the eyes, the face, the voice of our returning Lord, when others are counting out the profit they have made from what they were given, and we in our indolence present our useless talents? This is where these timorous people should rightly be afraid, not where there is so much profit and so little danger. Transition to outside. Did you read for a little bit while I transition?
Do you want me to read, Jody, or would you like to read for a minute? Okay. Authorities confuted by authorities. We will hasten on to the rest of the subject when we have quoted one other testimony. I have decided now to be content with two, but they are both weighty. Augustine, a man who was equally outstanding in erudition and holiness, and also of such a strict conscience, not to say hypercritical, that he often seems to me, I say it with apologies to so great a man, to tremble without cause, a thing which is easy to deduce from his life, and from his confessions and retractions. Augustine, I say, being the great man he was, would certainly have dissuaded people from secular literature, as they call it, if he had thought it harmful or useless or suspect. It is he who, in those books he entitles On Christian Doctrine, suggests two kinds of teaching, which are practiced even in Gentile, that is to say, pagan morals. He says, or secular, as those people call it. Of these kinds of teaching, one is concerned with those principles which have been instituted by men, the other with those which have come to their notice either as already established or as divinely instituted. That one, he goes on, which is established by men, is partly a matter of superstition and partly not. To avoid repeating the whole argument, which is a most prolix one, I will omit his actual words and sum up the whole thing briefly. In the last category, which he calls superstitious, he includes sorcery, incantations, enchantments, spells, divination by sacrifices or bird flight, soothsaying, necromancy, pyromancy, alphetomancy, hydromancy, geomancy, chiromancy, and other things of the same kind, which I'm not sure what those things are, but these belong to the soothsayers and wizards and can only be practiced by the aid of wicked spirits, and so he rightly judges them to be what Christians should shun. Certain types of observations he also assigns to this category because they are most productive of worry and futility. For instance, the interpretation of visions and dreams, inspection of entrails, the flight and song of birds, observation of monsters, thunderstorms, lightning, stars, casting lots, sneezing, weasels or mice running to meet one, or squeaking or nibbling at anything, ears ringing or eyes popping, leaves rustling, names and apparitions, and such like rubbish. Under the other heading of things instituted by men and yet free from superstition, he ranges these things: writing, names of things, manner of speech, laws, public decrees, and many other things of this nature. These he not only does not reprove, but he thinks they closely concern a Christian man, and he should do his best to learn them. You want to go?
Sure. Is it background noise too bad, or are you good? Is it good?
I don't hear any.
Oh, perfect. Okay. In the first class, that of notation places on logic, rhetoric, physics, arithmetic, geometry, music, finally histories and the knowledge of antiquity. I should even be ready to cite the opinion of St. Augustine about each one of these. But you must also be willing to hear. On grammar, his views are plain enough not to need discussion. And as to what pertains to dialectic, he argues lengthily and meticulously, as usual, about dialectical methods, truth and falsity of connections, the consequent and the inconsequent, opposition and definition and partition. I love hearing older writers enumerate all the liberal arts. It's like, this is a tradition that's been passed down. It's the whole thing. He even goes to St. Paul for the forms of connections, as he puts it, so that he seems to have wished to teach us if we are ignorant of dialectic. The discipline is commended by him in the same chapter of the treaty. I think I can give the wording since I have just read it, but in all kinds of questions which must be examined and solved in theological study, the skill knowledge of disputation is the greatest value. So essential is it here to avoid the inclination to quarrel. Oh, looking up disputation and disputatio, like write that word down and look it up. There's a whole pattern for that. And we will actually, next month in the fellowship is logic, and we'll be talking about it. So you'll be learning some of that next month. But it's such a helpful tool, especially when studying history. It's like this natural way to show arguments happening in real life, and like how to navigate that. But then also in the midst of it, you're learning all this knowledge about whatever the content is or subject matter is of the disputation as well. So just a little further on, there are steps in the reasoning process. He says, carrying with them false opinions, which follow on the error of the person engaged in debate, and may be used as inferences by a learned and good man, so that the one who has produced them will be covered with confusion and abandon his error. But if he insisted on retaining it, he would be obliged to stick to the very things he condemns. So much for dialectics. But did you want me to pause? Oh no, you were cheering.
No, I was cheering because I love that.
Yeah.
He would be obliged to stick to the very things he condemns, because so many times in those arguments, if you actually carry them out, they lead a path that you don't actually want to end up living.
Right. I think, and that's part of my issue with arguing for classical education only using Western works. Because I think if you play it out, what you're having to support is that there is one nation or one people group that have have more access to, or a better expression of truth, goodness, and beauty, have a more, like, they're the ones who have truth, goodness, and beauty. So they're the ones we have to read. Everyone else doesn't have that. And I'm like, what are you saying if you continue to say that? Like, it kind of justifies racism and all this other stuff that we're like is not okay. But then, so that's kind of my thinking behind why I make the arguments against sticking with the Western tradition. That, yeah, I just feel like the logic where it leads is not somewhere I'm comfortable ever defending. So that means I have a responsibility to be like, well, if I'm not willing to stand by that, then I can't stand by this. I get to be more open and challenge what I was holding as a darling. It's kind of beautiful out. Like, it's raining and it's just like covered space. And so it's like the smell of rain and it's like beautiful. And we're reading. I'm like, this is upside down.
Another thumbs up for your alfresco teaching.
Exactly. Okay.
So much for dialectics. Go ahead.
So much for dialectics. Style of writing. He's kind of snarky.
I do love it, actually.
To me,
it's very conversational, and he says funny things. And when he was talking about Augustine on the previous page, what does he say? He basically doesn't want to insult him or something like that. It was silly, and it made me laugh. I also, to go back to what you were saying before about him acknowledging, well, himself and Augustine and other people who have named what the liberal arts are. I also like that he acknowledges St. Paul in the Bible, and that he, although maybe he didn't name it that, but he lived it out. He was activating those liberal arts of the dialectic. But anyway.
Amen. So much for dialectics. As for the poets and orators, on whom he hath said a great deal, I am purposely omitting them here, intending to return to them in the right place. The other arts, less important certainly, but exacting, Augustine thought likely to be of no little advantage to a theologian, as Quintilian thought they were to an orator. And on the subject of music, we have this. We find meter and music honorably mentioned in many places in Scripture. The errors of Gentile superstition, however, are not to be listened to. They said the 9 muses were the daughters of Jove in memory. Then, quoting Varro, He explains how the fable began, adding, but whether it was as Varro narrated or not, we have no need to abandon music because of the superstitions of the unenlightened. If there is anything useful we can take from it for the understanding of scripture. You know, I have found that to be true because, like, for example, when I was reading the Odyssey and under and seeing the relationship between man and wife in ancient Greece, it helped me understand the New Testament and all the passages about marriage in the New Testament. All of a sudden, I had a container for understanding those verses. But when you push a modern perspective on some of those verses, it sounds some way. But then when I interpret it through the lens of actual ancient Greek culture, which is when it was written, it totally transformed my understanding of scripture and I understood it more. I was like, oh yeah, I mean, it is being written to a ancient Greek audience. Like, maybe that matters. I don't know.
Well, I think it's so great because we just become so familiar within our modern readings and understandings. And we kind of tell ourselves lies as we read about what things mean. And then another great reason, like you say in this whole chapter, this whole essay, as to why we need it. We don't even just want it and do it out of gratitude, but in order for us to read the scripture, we need to understand how they were thinking, the questions they were wrestling, the context within they lived, so that we can clearly see the truth. Otherwise, we're not seeing it fully.
Oh, exactly. I mean, like, another simple example of that is like, is John 1. I was raised thinking that in the beginning was the word and the word was with God, that the word, that word literally meant the Bible. Like, in the beginning was the Bible and the Bible was with God. Like, that's what I thought it meant. I mean, that's what I was taught it meant. But nobody that I learned from had studied Greek philosophy or knew enough of the Greek to then say, no, this is the word logos and this is the idea of it. It's kind of like the idea, you know, it wasn't just like a simple translation thing. It's like a whole concept, and a very difficult concept at that. So yeah, I'm right. Preach to the choir, sis. All right. The discussion on arithmetic is as follows. Even the ignorance of numbers results in the inability to understand many things, which are symbolically and mystically expressed in the scriptures.
This is so good, but you're choppy. You talk, and then I'm going to read for you. Oh, there you go. That might be helpful. Except I can't hear you at all. Oh, now I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah. Just hold it like this. Blessing you. I'm sorry.
Is that okay?
That's okay.
All right. All right, the discussion on arithmetic opens as follows. Even the ignorance of numbers results in inability to understand many things which are symbolically and mystically expressed in the scriptures. So when your kids say, oh, what am I going to use math for? There you go. All the complications of the discussions he enters into in the same way about geometry and astronomy, it is scarcely profitable to recall. Yeah, I don't know why that word's read a word and it doesn't seem normal to me. Okay, moving on. Profitable to recall. Again, he judges the knowledge of natural history, particularly necessary to the study of Holy Scripture, because it is scattered all over with the names of animals, plants, stones, and unless you have some idea of the importance and nature of these from the instruction of natural history, you will look pretty rash if you try to explain them. Here is the important point of this passage. Ignorance of objects makes figurative expressions obscure when we do not know the nature of animals, plants, or stones, or other things which occur in Scripture. and are used for the sake of some similitude. He continues the subject with pertinence and erudition. Oh, that is so good. And this, so you know how when we were studying grammar where you were talking about it's the reading symbols? It's like, I mean, I think this is what he's getting at. So it's first, so I mean, think about it in terms of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So grammar is learning to read symbols, like get to know things, whether it be in nature and literature, like all these different things, all these different objects. And then logic is putting things together in a rational way. And then rhetoric, you know, you have this communal thing, this with it, this representation with it. What I'm seeing in here is that pattern as well. That pattern again, that because he uses the term or other things which occur in scripture and are used for the sake of some similitude. So essentially, like how can you understand the comparison or the metaphor if you don't know, like if somebody's comparing a character in a story to a lion, but you don't know what a lion is, how are you going to understand the metaphor? How is it going to make sense to you? You're not going to read it properly. When it comes to the philosophers who particularly profess to teach the way to happiness, what does he say? Oh, by the way, this is also why it's important when we're teaching literature to teach it according to its nature. A lot of people, you know, will be like, this is of walking through the book, walking through the chapter, looking at all the beliefs, looking at all the symbols and explaining them. If you do those things, know what's happening in the story and then explaining those symbols, explaining those metaphors, making sure that people know what the imagery is, especially if it's ancient imagery that you would have to look up that maybe isn't intuitive because you're a modern, you know, like there we should feel no weirdness about that. And I think sometimes there's a discussion amongst different educators about whether we should do that or not. I hear it a lot on the Charlotte Mason side, where because Charlotte Mason's so big on not doing the learning for the student, I think sometimes teachers and moms get overly concerned that they're doing that if they explain anything at all. And I think that this section is a really helpful section to see the distinctions of it. It's like, no, I'm not doing the apprehension for you. I can't. I literally can't. What I'm doing is setting up the pieces of the feast so it's clear, like, hey, that's steak and you can eat that, but that's a spoon and you shouldn't eat that, but you can use it this way. And those aren't things that are intuitive unless you see someone else do it or coach. Like we could coach our kids how to eat. Yes, we don't digest. And I think using Charlotte Mason's metaphor about the feast, we don't digest for our kids, but we do prepare the food. We do set the table. We do say, hey, maybe not that much, or finish this. There's all sorts of coaching that happens around the eating of food. And that's not digesting it for them. So they'll end up choosing and gravitating towards what they prefer. And then their body just does the digesting on its own. It will be a marvel if he does not forbid them to be read. They have dared to proclaim themselves masters of truth, full of universal knowledge, and have thus shown themselves to be the originators of universal error, whose teachings produced almost all our heresies, whose intricate deductions, like so many battering rams, have almost all have been used to beat against the walls of Christian faith. Listen to what the justice of men says about them. If those who are called philosophers, especially the Platonists, have chanced to say things that are true and in agreement with our faith, far from fearing these utterances, we should claim them for our own, talking them over from their unlawful possessors. This is what people mean when they say plunder Egypt, plundering the Egyptians. Like, I don't know if you ever heard Callahan talk about the Egyptians or others, but it's that's exactly what they mean by that. I wish I could give you the exact words of what follows, a charming passage about the household goods of the Egyptians, but nevertheless, I will give a faithful account of it. We read in Exodus. He says that when the Hebrews were secretly preparing to fly under their leader Moses from their servitude in Egypt, each took from his obliging neighbor all sorts of household goods, an immense amount of rings, clothes, and vessels, and having spoiled the Egyptians, they departed secretly. As we know that this theft, was done with the sanction of God, we may take it that there is a significance here, that divine providence was acting in consideration for the timidity of some people who would have been frightened to spoil the Egyptians, that is, to take over the wisdom of the heathen, unless they had such an example of this very thing, such a commander, such a leader. To come out of Egypt is to leave behind heathen superstition and be converted to the Christian religion. To take away the wealth of Egypt is to transfer heathen literature to the adornment and use of our faith. The barbarians will perhaps make fun of the interpreter, and they would be right if I were not putting forward Augustine's interpretation, not mine. For just as the Hebrews, he says, in old days seized whatever they judged would be useful to them, leaving behind what they thought harmful or useless or unhallowed, so it behooves us to leave to the heathen their vices, superstitions, lusts, desires. These, I say, are to be left to their owners. But if there is among them any gold of wisdom, any silver of speech, any furniture of good learning, we should pack up all that baggage and turn it to our own use, never fearing to be accused of thieving, but rather venturing to hope for reward and praise for the finest of deeds. Here again, we must avoid the imputation of making difficulties on the question of what is to be left to the heathen as pernicious or adopted as useful. Augustine accepts nothing from his classification, but those things he names as superstitious. Otherwise, he does not withdraw from the arrangement of his, and this is characteristic of him. He wrote that those disciplines which were discovered by human minds, like dialectic, rhetoric, natural science, history, and so on, seemed to him marked out with gold and silver because men themselves did not produce them, but dug them out like gold and silver from what might be called the ore of divine providence, which runs through all things. By the close of the Egyptians, he understands disciplines which were certainly instituted by mortal men, but fitted like garments to human society, such as the rules of oratory, ordinances of the people, pontifical decrees, which indeed are all the greatest use, and in his opinion should by all means be snatched from the heathen. Lastly, he confirms and enriches the statement with a happy illustration. This was done by many of our good and faithful people. We do not see how Cyprian came out of Egypt with his bags stuffed with silver and clothing. Sweetest of scholars and blessed martyr as he was, how much did Lactantius bring, and Victorinus, Optatus, Hilary, to say nothing of the living, how much more was brought by the innumerable Greeks. Moses himself had done this first, that most faithful servant of God, of whom it is written that he was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. The prevailing heathen superstition would never have allowed such men as these to take over the disciplines
it considered useful, especially in times when it was trying to shake off the yoke of Christ and persecuting the Christians. If it had ever suspected that these studies would be used for worshiping the one God in order that the false cult of idols might be destroyed. Any thoughts on that section?
You know, the one line that stands out to me in that is on page 359 at the bottom. It's the third line from the bottom, and it says that divine providence was acting in consideration for the timidity of some people. And I think that it's easy to say, well, those timid people, those are the others. But again, remembering our own times of fear and that God was acting in divine providence and considering us in our timidity and in our fears and saying, I'm going to give a gift to you through the scriptures, through these Israelites' lives, and show you that you can model your life after them.
Yeah, one of the things that this raises for me is the question of like, well, how is this different than appropriation? And like, I wonder about that. And I'm, you know, like I think like, because technically appropriation is when you take something that someone else has created and then you take it and you kind of pass it off as your own or use it to earn money without crediting the other person. But like what he's describing here, it goes back to what he was saying in the beginning of the section. Like these aren't, they're patterns in nature. They're like observable for anyone. So it isn't that, or is it? Like I'm willing to like, you know, confront myself if it is. But these are the kind of questions I want to ask. Not everybody the question of appropriation. I am, but I do. I think it's an important question to wrestle with, especially for those of us who are leaders in the classical education movement that want to start more classical education schools. Like I can see this, like that in response to this topic, and so I want to have an answer for how it's different. If it's different, I want to be honest with myself if it's not, but I think it's different, like genuinely. And I think the reason is that these are patterns in nature that by, like, for example, one of the ancient Greeks named it rhetoric, but what they were observing was the natural process that human beings go through inside themselves when they're being something, and then how we should speak to them so that we can be in alignment with the nature of things, in alignment with the nature of how someone is persuaded. Learning something new, I need a refutation at some point because I'm going to have some concerns. Oh wait, you're muted.
Sorry, you're getting too excited and you're moving around again. I don't mind your excitement. I like it.
Yeah.
But just maybe the listeners who are going to listen to your audio recording might not be as
It's
excited.
going to be annoying. I'm sorry, everyone. That. But I think it was a pattern in nature. Whereas, for example, a specific like whatever a style of music is, and then another group of people adopting it, and then all of a sudden it becomes popular because a different group of people are using it, which is that's and something that transcends personal creativity, but are simply like, this is a pattern in nature. Like you plant a seed, you do this, and we're going to call this process farming or whatever. I don't know. You guys don't have anything to say about that. One of my personal wrestlings currently. We have 7 minutes left. So maybe finish reading the whole thing, but is there any other space that you wanted to jump into and discuss or ask questions about? I kind of liked reading aloud and just discussing it. It's kind of amazing. I mean, the downfall to it is that we're not getting through the whole thing, which we never do. So,
But that's why you have your continuing classes, and you can continue to read this every year, you know.
exactly. So, Bethany, did you have anything, or I don't know, Jody, if you read it ahead of time, was there anything in the rest of Erasmus's writings that you wanted to bring up?
I actually I read the first 2 sections, so I didn't get quite to the last section. I mean, the next section on education for children was just very, very bold and opinionated, which, you know, it was good. I'm trying to think here if there was something that stuck out to me. I think the thing that stuck out to me the most, just overall on that section, was just how I think that it's funny how issues back then are still issues today, how that transcends time. And, you know, you've got parents who will do everything to get their children educated to have a good job or a good career, but not take any time or intention to actually instruct and or push towards true education. So that, I think that's what kind of stuck out to me the most, is that seems to be still a common issue today.
Yeah, I was struck by that too. I'm like, wow, okay, maybe these will always stay conflicts. Like, it's like if we win this battle, then the battle will be won and it will never be a thing ever again. And to your point, I'm like, maybe it will always be, because there's always humans.
There are I have a couple quotes that I want to share. This one on page 362 in the first main paragraph. So it is possible that you may own land that is beautifully cultivated, but a son whose culture has been shamefully neglected, or a mansion filled with exquisite works of art, but a son whose soul has no beauty at all. I loved it. Honestly, this section, and I had just read a couple of chapters from Charlotte Mason's volume number 2, and this reminds me so much of her admonitions of honing in those habits and the importance of not letting them become, like this quote, but man certainly is not born, but made. Where everything is done at the whim of physical desire, reason does not hold its rightful place. And then down below, continue down on the right-hand side of page 363 at the bottom. It is beyond argument that a man who has never been instructed in philosophy or in any branch of learning is a creature quite inferior to the brute animals. Animals only follow their natural instincts, but man, unless he has experienced the influence of learning and philosophy, is at the mercy of impulses that are worse than those of a wild beast. And prior to this, then the next line. There is no beast more savage and dangerous than a human being who is swept along by their passions of ambition, greed, anger, envy, extravagance, and sensuality. And I think that that was something that I hadn't thought about regarding the instincts of beasts. That those instincts are, although not to the same level, but they're quite orderly. Like they say, bees know how to make things. They're little beehives, like they have some semblance of order within their instincts. And that we, man, human, our children, that when we are at our impulses, we are worse than those of that beast because we don't have those same instincts to just naturally do that which is orderly and good and fully human.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's such a good point. And that is so powerful. Right, because if we were truly animals, we really wouldn't have a say in how we did things. We would just be according to nature, follow those impulses and instincts, which makes a difference. Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about it exactly that way before. That's really good. That's really good.
And to Jody's point, on page 364, the strong opinion, unless you mold and shape the mind of your child, you will be the father of a monster and not a human being. It's pretty strong.
I think the image that I had in my mind as I was reading this part was of just kind of like the spoiled, wealthy, rich kid who just gets set up for everything and doesn't really have to work or think. And then, and then even that the last part you read on 363, being swept along by passions, it's like we see that a lot in our society. Unfortunately, we see that even it's becoming exposed from very high levels too, and it's just, yeah, I guess, in him saying that of a monster, I mean, that is harsh, but in some cases I guess that is true.
Yeah, and I think I also think, well, my mind always when I read things like that is like, okay, well, how am I a monster right now? Like what in me, what actions in me have me not ruling myself? And so I think it goes back to that. Like he's using very strong imagery, which yeah, I think it's good to sit with. And also, like, this is what we mean by a monster or whatever, an animal doesn't rule themselves. And so I can learn to rule myself. But at the same time, I'm always learning new lessons. Like there's always going to be another sin for me to overcome. There another way that I perceive the world where I'm subject to my subconscious on something where I'm like, Paul says, why do I do what I don't want to do? So while this is true, I think it's also important to put the other polarization up there, because where I will go is I will just start beating myself up about everything I've done wrong, and then I'll start freaking out about, anytime I see my kids acting like animals. Like I have failed. And there's these pulls here of like, and I also don't want to give way to be like, oh, just make excuses for myself because I don't want to feel ashamed of something. And, so it's like these two sides of it, but I do think it's important for us to hold them in tension at all times. Anything else?
Well, thank you.
Tonight has been lovely.
It's been really nice. I've not seen you here before, Jody. Are you going to join us in June?
Yeah, so I just kind of found this, and so I'm just getting kind of acquainted to it. I've had this book on my shelf and opened it a few times, but I was really excited to actually dig into it, so, and have a reason to. So
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you joined us. How did you find out about the group?
Yeah.
I actually found your YouTube channel and just watched some of your videos.
Oh, really? So that's how you found it.
So
Okay.
I homeschool, and I have young children. My oldest is going to be in 6th grade. So I'm new-ish to classical education, I should say. So I've been aware of it for a long time, just a little apprehensive and not really knowing where to dive in.
Yeah. Well, welcome. We're so glad you're here, and please reach out if there's any support I can offer. We have this, and then we also have, we've done it once, and our intention is to do it every quarter for this new year starting up. A Classical Teaching 101 free workshop series. So like each quarter we'll do a Saturday morning of like 2 to 3 workshops on some topic of classical education. So be looking for that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I usually share everything through the email list, and then social media. So if you're following us, email is probably the most consistent way to get like updates of what we're doing. But
And she hasn't bragged about herself, but you really should come and join the fellowship with us because it's wonderful. And I will rave and tell you about what a gift it's been for me. And I've only been involved for the last few months. It's my first time and Jennifer's second year, but it's been a delight. And I feel like I'm a better human, at least on the inside. And I'm working on actually putting it into practice and being a better mom and a better teacher at home. But yeah, you should join us. You should come join us in June next month.
well, yeah. So yes, the registration for the fellowship is open now, and we'll start with a new cohort in July. So it'll be open for registration through July.
Okay. Sounds
So,
good.
yeah.
Have you read about her fellowship already?
I've read
is on
yeah,
her website?
I have read on it. Yeah. So I know I'm like stalker. I've looked up everything.
I think we're all stalkers of you. And that's what I mean. We've all said that so far. Almost all of us in the fellowship have at one time said, I Googled all over. I found you on this website and that website, and I knew we had to be friends.
Homeschool moms be like. I love
Tell
it.
me,
I love it.
can you tell us about your kids?
Yeah. So I have my oldest, my son, he's 10, almost 11. And then I have a 8-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old daughter. So that's why I had to have my video off for a while. There's a lot going on.
No problem. Yeah.
Yes.
That's awesome. Beautiful full house. I love it.
Yes. Well, thank you, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Thank you, ladies. And I look forward to
That was a delight.
next month. We're going to be reading a more modern guy. So, okay, I've actually never heard about the next guy we're reading, but he's the first of the Enlightenment thinkers in this list. It's Guillaume Battista Vico. So, okay, on the proper order of studies. from On the Study Methods of Our Time and the Academies and the Relation Between Philosophy and Eloquence. So he's from him through John Henry Newman are during the time of the Enlightenment. So I've categorized them together. And then the following month, we'll read Irving Babbitt, and then we'll be back in Ancients with Xenophon. So we're just going to keep going in that pattern of one from Ancients, then from early Christianity, or well, one from classical period, then early Christianity, then medieval, then Reformation, exploration, Enlightenment, and modern. So those are the main categories for all the authors he has in here. But, all right. Y'all have a fantastic night.